Hello everyone and welcome into Coach Craig's Sports. This is going to be kind of a special video today. We are going to be doing a UFL preview. So if you are not familiar with the UFL whatsoever, it is the combined league of the USFL and the XFL. Obviously these two leagues came together, kind of a lot that happened with that if you haven't been following along. But essentially what I want to do in this video is just kind of go team by team, kind of the players that are on the 50-man rosters for these teams, kind of the expected roles, who I expect to kind of start for these teams. And then from there, hopefully we have UFL DFS over on DraftKings this year, so I'll be doing kind of weekly videos for that. If there's not that, then maybe we'll talk some UFL props kind of week to week, some of that type of stuff. But just want to get that preview out there, kind of walking through these teams, seeing who's there. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of different situations with the combination of these two leagues coming together. So that's going to change some roles for players overall. There is a couple coaching staff moves as well, but for the most part, we have pretty much similar coaching staffs, just some different faces in some different places at the end of the day. But with that being said, we are going to get started with the Birmingham Stallions. So back-to-back winners of the USFL, and Jamar Smith is going to be their quarterback to start the season. He was their quarterback to start last season. Obviously, he had that injury, I would believe, in his finger where he broke it. He had surgery, and then Alex McGough came in, and the rest is kind of history from there. Alex McGough went on to win the MVP, and they went on to win the title once again. There is a lot of hype for Matt Corral as kind of coming in as the former third-round pick of the Carolina Panthers. Everybody's just like, oh, he's going to be quarterback one, but important to keep in mind that Jamar Smith's been here for 2 years. He also played college ball with Skip Holtz, too, at Louisiana Tech, so there's a lot of continuity there. It's his job to lose at this point in time, so unless he goes out and he loses it or gets injured, safe to assume that he will be the starter at quarterback. And then at running back, we got CJ Maribel returning as their top leading rusher from last year. He is going to be their running back one. And then behind him, we have Larry Roundtree, who was a former day 3 pick by the Los Angeles Chargers. Really didn't do too much at the NFL level. Was pretty good at Missouri, though. A little bit of kick return experience for him as well. And then same could be said with Ricky Person Jr., who returns to the team. Kind of that backup running back for a little bit last season. Did a little bit of kick returning for them as well. Personally, I think Roundtree is probably going to be the running back 2, and then we'll see Ricky Person Jr. as kind of the running back 3. I could be wrong about that. Important to note, Bo Scarborough did retire, although he barely played last season with his own injury, and then Bobby Holly, the fullback, who was injured most last year, was cut in their first round of cuts as well. We get down to the wide receiver position, so there has been some rumblings over the last couple of days that Victor Bolton Jr. is no longer with the team, whether or not he's retiring, he's getting cut. Kind of a lot of theories out there, so we're not going to talk too much about him. And then we've seen in recent days that they did cut Myron Mitchell, who was kind of one of their 4th or 5th wide receivers last year. Slade Bolton, who was a former undrafted wide receiver out of the University of Alabama. And then Chris Lacey was cut in the first round of cuts, a guy that's bounced around a lot of practice squads. So mainly for their team, Deion Kane returns. He's another guy who could do the kick returning duties once again as well, because he was pretty good at that last season. I think 2 kick return touchdowns. But he is going to be one of their starters on the outside. I assume Marlon Williams will be the other if he's healthy from his injury that he sustained last year after like the second game of the season, I want to say it was. If he's good to go, those will be the 2 starters on the outside. However, if Marlon Williams isn't good to go, we might see some Kevin Austin out there, who is a very interesting prospect out of Notre Dame. Spent some time on the Jaguars practice squad, probably a guy that should have gone back to school for one more season. And then Gary Jennings could be a guy that plays a little bit of inside and outside, a little bit of versatility there. And then kind of in the slot, most people expecting Amari Rodgers, the former 3rd-round pick by the Green Bay Packers, to occupy that slot role. And then they did pick up Isaiah Zuber off waivers as well from Houston, who did play a little bit of corner last year. Primarily played wide receiver in the past, so we'll see what Birmingham's plan is for him overall. And then kind of last guy to talk about in this wide receiver room is going to be Benjamin Victor, who's a former Ohio State undrafted guy. Spent a little bit of time on like the Ravens practice squad, but I think he's kind of the odd man out here. I don't see too much out of him, but at the same time, it's hard to rule out these Ohio State wide receivers because we've seen time and time again them succeed, whether it's the NFL level, the USFL level, this level, hopefully the UFL level now, and then the CFL level as well with Austin Mack last season. So can't completely write him off, but I would assume that he's kind of lowest on the pecking pole at this point in time. We move down to tight end. We got Jay Sternberger there returning as the lead guy. Marcus Bowe comes over from the Michigan Panthers. Should be a viable tight end 2 behind him. So maybe a little bit more tight end sets this season. He's probably going to take on, that LaMichael Petaway role from last year. And then they did sign Jordan Thomas as well, who spent some time with the Battlehawks and the Guardians last year. So could be an interesting third tight end, kind of a bigger athletic guy who spent some time on the Carolina Panthers practice squad this year as kind of an edge prospect at that. So a little bit of an interesting story. Birmingham Stallions defense is going to be very good once again. They have a very good linebacker core, despite, them picking Chris Orr in, I believe, is the Spursel draft, and he ultimately ended up retiring. But they got Tizino alongside Scooby right now. They got a good defensive line. They got good defensive backs. It's going to be a really good defense once again overall. So Birmingham is going to be a very, very strong team once again. We moved down to Houston Roughnecks. They're just the next team that was on my list. So we got kind of this quarterback battle going on right now. So it has been announced that Jared Garantano, probably mispronouncing his name once again, he is technically quarterback 1 for week 1. We don't really know who quarterback 2 is going to be, whether it's Nolan Henderson or Reed Sinnett. I think a lot of people, myself included, assume that this was just going to be Reed Sinnett's job to lose, but that does not appear to be the case. Curtis Johnson, the head coach, has said that multiple quarterbacks will play at least early on in the season until they kind of find their guy. So don't rule out any of these 3 at this point in time, but probably not a situation you're going to want to chase, whether you're playing like UFL Fantasy or UFL DFS, at least early on in the season. And I guess that's something I didn't mention earlier, too. We're going to look at the coaching staffs, too. Everybody returned for Birmingham, so not really too concerned there. And then for the Roughnecks, it's the same crew as well. And then we move down to running back. We got Mark Thompson here, who will be the running back 1. I believe I saw like a little bit of a story saying like he tweaked his knee just a little bit, knee sprain, something like that. So maybe he'll be a little bit slower to start off the season, but they do have 2 very capable backups behind him. TJ Pledger, who played pretty well in his absence last season. And then Tyon Evans comes in as well. He was a undrafted free agent. He played his college ball at Tennessee and Louisville. Had a pretty decent year at Louisville in his final season there, so could be pretty interesting. The one thing I will say about this running back room is none of these guys really offer much in the pass catching department. Yes, they can all catch the ball, but nobody really truly specializes in that. And then, that first round of cuts, we did see them cut Ezra Gray, Shamari Jones, and Ryan Nall. So guys that were probably a little bit more capable in that pass catching department just in general. Then we move down to the receivers. It's a pretty interesting receiver room now. I don't think it was that great last year. Obviously, we just saw like a lot of Justin Hall, and then kind of everybody else here and there just kind of cycled through. So Justin Hall returns as kind of their top leading receiver. He's probably going to be used in the slot quite a bit as well. And then Isaiah Heaney came over from the Pittsburgh Maulers, a similar type of player. So we'll see how that all works out. They do return some bigger physical outside wide receivers in Anthony Retief Williams, Emmanuel Butler, and Chike Kism as well. Not really expecting too much out of these guys, especially with some of the new additions, mainly Stephen Dunbar Jr. coming over from the CFL and Kirk Merritt coming over from the Saints, who did spend some time with them in recent seasons, kind of bouncing between the practice squad and the NFL roster. And then Cyril Grayson is here kind of too as a kick and punt return specialist. So wouldn't be surprised if they kind of narrow this down just a little bit more. Kind of surprised that Grayson's still on the team just because Justin Hall and Isaiah Heaney both can kind of do a little bit of kick and punt returning as well. So it should be a pretty interesting group of wide receivers here. Maybe hampered a little bit by the quarterback play, at least early on in the season. And then we keep moving down to the tight ends. Mainly blocking tight ends here for the most part. They bring over 2 of the guys from the New Jersey Generals and Brandon Bowman and Woody Branham. And then they went out and signed Derek Dees Jr., who is kind of another blocking tight end. And then Clint Sig returns from last year's squad, probably their best capable receiving tight end now at this point in time. So it should be pretty interesting. Don't expect the tight ends to be super involved, but they're going to be involved in that blocking department, blocking for Mark Thompson and company. Roughnecks defense, I think they'll be all right this season. They were pretty decent at times last year. I think at least early on, I probably have them in like my bottom 4. But we'll see what it looks like as the season moves along. Then we move down to the Memphis Showboats, who are a team that did have a coaching staff change. So we're going to scroll over here real quick and just talk about that. So John DiFilippo comes in as the head coach of the Memphis Showboats. He was the Breakers head coach in 2023. He brings alongside him Doug Martin, who is the offensive coordinator for the Breakers in 2023 as well. They did retain Carnell Lake as the defensive coordinator, though. So he was the defensive coordinator for the Showboats in 2023. So he is going to be there. He's familiar with a lot of these players that they do have on defense. But overall, the Showboats were one of the teams that did have a ton of changes on the roster overall. So Cole Kelly, who was their primary quarterback last year, has has been cut. I think it was kind of a mutual thing where he wanted to go somewhere else where he had a better chance of playing, since they brought in Case Cookus through, I believe, the dispersal draft, and then they signed Troy Williams as well. And then when they ultimately ended up cutting Cole Kelly, Josh Love came in as well. So you see 3 quarterbacks here that were starters in the USFL at one point in time over the past 2 seasons. Case Cookus is going to be the lead guy there, quarterback 1. Troy Williams, I would assume, is quarterback 2, and then Josh Love would be your quarterback 3. So do you really expect Case Cookus to have a pretty good season, especially in this John DeFilippo offense? And then we moved into running backs. So running backs going to be pretty interesting as well. They brought over both the Generals running backs in Darius Victor and Trey Williams. Obviously, we've seen a lot of success from those 2 guys over the past couple seasons. And then they also brought in Titus Swen, who was an undrafted rookie out of Wyoming, who did put up some pretty good numbers the past couple of years there, but he did have a couple off-the-field issues where, maybe some NFL teams weren't as willing to take some shots on him. Could be a very interesting guy there. I think all 3 of these guys should see some run at some point this season. Darius Victor, obviously kind of your bowling ball, bruiser running back, and then Trey Williams out of the backfield, more of a zero pass catching back. Titus Swen could do a little bit of both as well. For the wide receiver room, it's going to be a pretty interesting one. They did bring over a couple different guys from the New Orleans Breakers. So from the Breakers, they brought over Lee Morris, who's kind of the slot wide receiver there for them. D. Anderson, who's kind of one of their backup outside wide receivers. And then Jonathan Adams Jr. is going to be the biggest one, who was one of those top wide receivers for the Breakers. Should be the top wide receiver for the Showboats team as well. And I think when we're talking about it too, the first round of cuts, we saw Derek Dillon, the top wide receiver for the Showboats last season, get cut. And then in the second round of cuts, we saw Ryan McDaniel and Richard Davis also get cut as well, who were, kind of wide receivers that played a role last season. So truly the only wide receiver left from the Showboats team from last year is going to be Vinny Papali, who oddly enough did sign with the Breakers before the merger. So John DeFilippo did show some trust in him overall. And it's going to be interesting with him and Lee Morris kind of competing for that slot spot. DeAndre Overton can play a little bit of slot too as well. He comes over from the Philadelphia Stars. He can play on the outside as well. And then when they also do have David Davis here, who is a Western Kentucky undrafted free agent that, could have a little bit of interest here and there at times as well. So pretty deep, pretty good wide receiver room just in general to work for Case Cookus. Then at the tight end position, they still have 4 guys listed here. They ended up cutting Dominic Daphne and Cam Sutton recently, but they do have a couple of returnees here in J.J. Wilson and John Mitchell. And then we have Wes Saxton Jr. coming over from the New Jersey Generals, and Sage Surratt coming over for the Breakers, who should be their tight end one, kind of that receiving tight end. When they go to the blocking more so, it's probably going to be Wes Saxton or J.J. Wilson out there on the field, though. So should make for a pretty interesting team. I think that Showboats defense should take a step up. Although some of the guys that they brought in this offseason that I thought were going to stick with the team, they did end up cutting. So they might be a team that's in the bottom 4 in defense once again, or right on the borderline of, that like 4 and 5 spot just in general. Then we move down to the Michigan Panthers. They did have a couple of coaching staff changes, so we'll highlight those. Mike Nolan is back as the head coach, but they have Marcel Bellafleur. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he was the Philadelphia Stars wide receiver coach and passing game coordinator last season. He takes over as the offensive coordinator. And then Colin Bauer was promoted from defensive line coach to defensive coordinator for this Michigan Panthers team overall. So it should make for some pretty interesting developments there. I think Bauer's going to do pretty well with the defense once again, and we'll see probably a little bit different style offense this year for this Michigan Panthers team overall. They do return E.J. Perry at quarterback, which was a big thing for this team overall. He only played 2 games for them last year, but, they coming out of Brown, a dual threat quarterback who should do very well in this league once again. We did see it in one of the games that he started last year. Behind him is, Danny Etling out of LSU that bounced around a lot of NFL practice squads over the years. Most recently was with the Packers. Has a little bit of speed there as a quarterback. Don't really think he's that great overall, though. And then Davis Cheek was kind of their third guy in camp most of the time, but he decided to retire, so they brought back Brian Lewerke out of Michigan State. At running back, you got a couple different guys here. Raymond Calais is technically on the suspended list at this point in time. Probably one of those guys that just didn't report to camp. But Wes Hills is going to be the primary back here. He was the running back for the New Orleans Breakers last season. And then behind him, we got Matthew Colburn, who was one of the Philadelphia Stars running backs last year. Pretty important, especially in the passing game. He should be pretty involved as well. And then behind them, there is Nate McRae, who played at Saginaw Valley State and has bounced around some NFL practice squads. So it should be a pretty talented running back room overall. Then we move over to the wide receivers. You're going to see a lot of names coming over from the Philadelphia Stars. just because, their offensive coordinator was the wide receiver coach there and is now the offensive coordinator of the Michigan Panthers. Devin Gray and Jordan Sewell, the top two kind of wide receivers over the last couple of years for the Philadelphia Stars, come over. Obviously, they did have Corey Coleman last year as well, who, they tried to bring Corey Coleman over, but he decided to retire just instead. So we're not going to talk too much about him. Terry Wright was another guy they brought over, but have since cut. So interesting wide receiver room. We'll start with those two guys, Devin Ross, Marcus Sims. Both have been on the Panthers, I believe, both seasons now. Ross really did nothing last year. Sims had a couple decent flashes here and there. And then Trey Quinn's kind of the biggest wide receiver returning for them. He was very, very productive in the slot for them last season. So I think mainly you're going to see Devin Gray, Jordan Sewell, and Trey Quinn on the field. They also do have John Hightower, who they signed late in camp here, who did spend some time with the Philadelphia Eagles and the Los Angeles Chargers over the last 3 seasons. So he could be a guy that factors in as well. He's probably a guy that fits in better on the outside. So I'd probably say, honestly, they don't have too much in terms of slot here. So I think the safest guy in terms of slot work is going to be Trey Quinn, though. And then Desmond Patton's kind of down here, too. He blended in for whatever reason. So he's a guy that spent some time on the Colts and Bills practice squads mainly. So he could be interesting. I believe he was a Washington State guy. Played with Gardner Minshew there. Bigger body wide receiver. Not the quickest guy in the world, though, whatsoever. Then at tight end, they have a couple different guys here. I believe this is Nick Jugamus. Not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right whatsoever. He's on IR right now at this point in time. So mainly it's going to be Gunnar Oates, and then Cole Hukatini returns as well. So he was kind of their receiving tight end last year. So he should factor in pretty good once again. And then for the Panthers defense, I expect this to be a pretty good unit once again. They do have quite a bit of depth here. They even ended up cutting some pretty decent players, including like Warren Saba. They did lose Josh Butler last year. I think they replaced him in a pretty decent way, though. So not too worried about their defense. Should be a pretty interesting team overall, though. Then we move down to the Arlington Renegades, the champions of the XFL from last season. So coaching staff's going to be pretty similar. Bob Stoops does return as the head coach. Chuck Long takes over as the full offensive coordinator. It was him and Jonathan Hayes sharing duties last year. And then Jay Hayes takes over as defensive coordinator. I believe he shared duties last year. I believe it was with Tim Lewis. So co-defensive coordinator, co-offensive coordinator last season, taking over as the offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator this year. So expect pretty similar results and pretty similar schemes to what we saw last year, just in general, though. But at quarterback, Luis Perez returns. They were a completely different team when he took over at quarterback, so he will be the starter once again. And then behind him, 2 interesting young players. So Holton Ahlers played at Eastern Carolina, spent some time on the Seattle Seahawks practice squad and preseason roster this season. Kind of a lefty. A little bit of mobility there. Should be a pretty interesting prospect behind Luis Perez. And then Lindsey Scott bounced around a lot of schools in college, but he is a kind of guy that's a little bit undersized, but does have, some mobility as well. Should be a pretty interesting prospect. They also did have Drew Plitt in camp, who spent some time with them last year, but was ultimately cut. And then at running back, they had 5 guys in camp. So it was Davion Smith, Letty Brown, Devin Darrington, Morgan Ellis, and Day Hunter. Darrington was kind of with the Guardians last year. Thought maybe stick around just for the pass catching work, but he got cut. Morgan Ellison was pretty good last year with the Seattle Sea Dragons. He got cut, though, too, as well. So they're mainly leaning on the top 2 guys once again, Davion Smith and Letty Brown. And then Day Hunter behind him. Played his college ball at Hawaii and Liberty. Some people kind of liked him for college fantasy, but was never really like a truly big name prospect. So would expect Davion Smith and Letty Brown kind of split the workload once again. Once again, this is a running back room that doesn't truly have that great pass catcher there, though, overall. Moving down to the wide receivers, we're going to see a lot of familiar names here from last season. So Dante Burnett is a guy that joined the team, I believe, via the dispersal draft. He comes over from the Houston Roughnecks, the old Houston Roughnecks, I should say. He's going to be one of the guys that probably starts on the outside for them. Tyler Vaughn's probably going to start on the opposite side on the outside, but I do assume that they'll rotate some guys behind them, kind of like they did last year. Javonte Payton was pretty good for them in the playoffs. Lawan Winningham had some moments here and there. And then Isaiah Winstead comes over, who did spend some time on the 49ers practice squad. And then in the slot, we're probably going to see Caleb Van Den Esch start there with Juwan Moningo going behind him. Can't really say too much here. I still don't think it's the greatest wide receiver room, but they do have some pretty functional players. Unfortunately, the second round of cuts, we did see Cy Barnett, who was a guy that I did interview last year out of Ferris State and Davenport University. Unfortunately, he got cut. He was a pretty interesting prospect, posted very, very good numbers at his pro day, and he had some experience as a wide receiver, kick returner, punt returner, kicker, and punter. So he was a pretty versatile player. We'll see if somebody else ultimately ends up picking him up or not. And then at tight end, it looks like they're going more with the functional athletes at tight end this year. So Sal Cannell returns. And then behind him, we have Seth Green, who's a pretty athletic tight end. Spent some time on the practice squad for the Texans and Cowboys in recent years. And then Austin Allen is their third tight end as kind of a guy that, he's pretty big. He's pretty athletic. He played his college ball at Nebraska, went undrafted, and then spent some time on the Giants and Packers practice squads. I think the Arlington defense should be all right once again. I don't know if they're going to be quite as good as they were last year, but we'll just have to see it as the year moves along. Kind of last year, the one big thing for them was that secondary, how deep they were there. That really helped them overall. Moving down to the DC Defenders, their coaching staff remains the same. They retain their head coach, offensive coordinator, and defensive coordinator. Jordan Teama returns as the quarterback one for this team. We did see Derek King join the coaching staff ranks at the college level. He's a quarterback's coach now, so he will not be returning. So Jalen McClendon will be the backup quarterback behind him. Started some games for the Vegas Vipers last season and didn't play too poorly in those games. And then their third-string quarterback is going to be DeAndre Francois. Did open the season kind of as one of those starting quarterback options for the Orlando Guardians last year. But he's a guy that hasn't really lived up to his potential since the Florida State days. He was all right in the Fan Control Football League, but can't say too much else about that. Abram Smith, their top running back, is on IR. He's done for the year, unfortunately, due to an ACL tear. They did return Cameron Harris and Puka Williams, who both didn't really play too much for them last season. Cameron Harris is going to be like kind of their main early down back, it sounds like. He's kind of the biggest body that they do have left at this point in time. And then Puka Williams and Darius Higgins are the other two running backs. They're more of your scat back variety just in general. So I think Puka Williams is probably going to be running back 2, Darius Higgins be running back 3, but we'll just have to see. And their wide receiver room's kind of been an interesting one so far, this late winter, early spring. They brought in a lot of different bodies over the time. They cut a lot of pretty good players over that time as well. So we'll see what it looks like ultimately. I think right now we're probably looking at Brandon Smith and Kelvin Harmon starting on the outside. Kelvin Harmon does have some NFL experience there. And then in the slot, we're probably going to see some combination of Chris Rowland and Kiki QT. And QT's obviously got some NFL experience as well. Chris Rowland came over from the Stars. And then the other wide receivers they got there are Vincent Smith out of Limestone University. Played some with the Texans and Jets. Pretty good speedster. He's another guy that should see some time on the outside as well. And then they also do have Ty Scott coming over from Missouri State. Was an undrafted free agent in last year's class. Can't really say too much about him now at this point in time. But if you look at some of the guys that they rotated through, C.J. Johnson didn't make the team, was pretty good at Eastern Carolina. Jazz Ferguson, he's had some hype here and there in these spring leagues, but he got cut. He did a little bit last year for the team. Then there was Trey Shropshire, I believe it was, out of UAB. Was a pretty interesting prospect for the UFL, but did not make the team as well. Mike Harley Jr. tried to come over from the Cleveland Browns, didn't make it either. And then Preston Williams got cut very, very early on for this team overall as well. So some pretty significant names there that didn't make it. So that tells you something that they at least feel good about the guys that they do have, that they're picking them over some of the more experienced, maybe even more talented players. But there's some pretty big holes to fill because Lucky Jackson, Chris Blair, both are in the NFL now, and then Josh Hammond did ultimately end up retiring. Then we move down to tight end. Sean Byer comes over from the Arlington Renegades, but he's going to start the year on IR. So the other guys that they kind of have, Alex Ellis and Burley Moore McKinney, both return this season. I do assume Moore's going to be like kind of the main tight end here, although they did sign Caden Smith pretty late in camp, so he's a guy that does have NFL experience. Obviously played some with the New York Giants, so he could be another interesting option for them, a guy that I did like quite a bit. And then there's Ben Brishanen, who is coming over from Vanderbilt, undrafted free agent as well. Don't know a whole heck of a lot about him, but should be, kind of just a reserve role more or less. For the DC Defenders, their defense is going to be pretty good once again. It's going to be a very aggressive defense. Don't expect that to be lacking whatsoever. Their defensive line is really good. They even ended up cutting Tim Ward in recent days, and he signed with San Antonio. Go back with his former coaching staff. So they are going to be a defense to look out for once again. Then we move down to the San Antonio Brahmas. Their coaching staff essentially is the old Houston Roughnecks coaching staff. So we got Wade Phillips coming over. AJ Smith as offensive coordinator, and then Will Reed is going to be their defensive coordinator this year. He's a former Southern Arkansas defensive coordinator, so we'll see how that ultimately plays out. But, Wade Phillips is going to have his hands on the blueprint of that defense overall either way. They do not retain any quarterbacks from last year. They don't bring any quarterbacks over from the whole Houston Roughnecks either. So Quentin Dormady and Chase Garbers are kind of competing for the quarterback 1 spot at this point in time. It has been announced that Tom Flacco will be the quarterback 3. So Dormady had some pretty good weeks last year with the Orlando Guardians. Then Chase Garbers played his college ball at Cal and then has been on the Raiders practice squad the last 2 seasons. So we'll see how that ultimately pans out. But whoever ultimately ends up being the quarterback is going to be a guy that you want for fantasy purposes and for DFS purposes just in general. And then at running back, they got Bryson Allen, who did come over with the Houston coaching staff. John Lovett was with the Vegas Vipers last year. And then Anthony McFarland out of Maryland spent some time with the Pittsburgh Steelers, is also on this team as well. So if I had to guess right now with this running back room, I think it's going to be a lot of a committee. So we'll just have to see if anybody truly stands out as the weeks move along. But maybe Bryson Allen gets the first crack just because he's familiar with the coaching staff. But I wouldn't be surprised if the other 2 backs get worked in quite a bit because they are quite talented as well. Moving down to the wide receiver room. So you're going to see kind of a mix and match here. So you're going to see some guys that were on San Antonio last year. You're going to see a lot of guys coming over from the old Houston Roughnecks as well. So Landon Akers was on this team last season. He is kind of a slot player. He was a guy that Houston ultimately signed or traded for in the offseason too as well. So they were trying to bring him over there, and now they get to bring him back either way. KD Cannon played a little bit with the Guardians last year. He's a guy out of Baylor. Does have some top-end speed, but probably going to be a reserve for them more or less. Justin Smith, I know the offensive coordinator, AJ Smith, likes quite a bit, but I still think he's going to be a reserve player on the outside. I think ultimately on the outside we're going to see TJ Vasher and Jonte Kirkland. Kirkland obviously was doing extremely well before his shoulder injury. And then Vasher, played a decent role for San Antonio last year. They also did bring over Matt Leanders on waivers. Was pretty good at Arkansas in his final year of college football. Spent some time on the Seattle Seahawks practice squad. Could be an interesting name there. Guy that probably could give you a little bit of inside-outside versatility. Marquez Stevenson, Speedy Stevenson out of the University of Houston, former 6th-round pick by the Buffalo Bills. Dealt with a lot of injuries, so really didn't make an impact for them. Could be an interesting guy, and I would assume more likely than not he'll kind of be their second slot player just in general. In this air raid offense, you're probably going to see a lot of 3-4 wide receiver sets, and even when we talk about these tight ends, we got Cody Lattimore here, who was really good for the Orlando Guardians last year, with probably the most effective tight end. We'll use tight end in quotation marks just because he was primarily a big slot, and then Alize Mack is the other tight end behind him returning to this team. So it should make for a pretty interesting team overall. I think this wide receiver room is going to be pretty good once again. Running backs, they definitely have some talent there, but they're going to cycle through them. And then quarterback just kind of ultimately ends up starting, whether it's Dormady or Chase Garbers ultimately being the guy for the majority of the season. Their defense should be pretty good once again. San Antonio did have some talent on their defense that they did inherit, and then Houston brought over some of the guys that they like. So I think it's going to be a decent defense overall. Then we move down to the Battlehawks. So the Battlehawks do retain A.J. McCarron at quarterback. He went to the NFL, then came back. And then behind him is going to be Brandon Silvers, the former Houston Roughnecks quarterback. And then Manny Wilkins is also around as kind of a guy returning. It's probably the quarterback 3 for them overall. At running back, though, it's going to get a little bit interesting this year. There's no Brian Hill, so we have Mateo Durant returning. We'll see whether or not he ultimately gets the first crack or not. Could be Wayne Gallman, though, because he does have that NFL experience. Good running back at Clemson. Good backup running back at the NFL level as well, which is kind of something we saw similar with Brian Hill last year. So I think ultimately Gallman should be the guy. We'll just kind of have to see what type of shape he's in, though. And then they do also have Jacob Sailors, who played his college ball at East Tennessee State and then spent some time on the Atlanta Falcons practice squad this most recent season. We get down to their wide receiver room, which is absolutely stacked. So they retained Darius Shepard, Hakeem Butler, and Marcel Aitman, the top 3 wide receivers from them last year. And then Austin Pearl is not there, but they replaced him with Blake Jackson. They also do have Ja'Cory Pierce. Somebody's going to start off the year on IR. He's dealing with a little bit of a knee injury. Jeff Thomas is another guy that's had some spring football playing time, I'll say. I won't really truly say success, but he's an interesting guy there that could do some punt return duties as well. And then they brought over Jamarcus Bradley, who spent some time on NFL practice squads. Bigger wide receiver, should be pretty interesting. And then Jerome Kapp, who had a really good preseason with the Jets out of Kutztown, should be another interesting name there. So really deep wide receiver room just in general. And then at tight end, they just have Jake Sutherland, who is kind of their blocking tight end. And then Kamari Avery comes over as well. He played his college ball at Louisville and Bethune-Cookman. So there's kind of a weird gap in there, too. He got into some legal trouble. So we'll see ultimately if he can kind of right those wrongs of his past. And then that Battlehawks defense should be pretty interesting. Once again, they kind of revamped this defense overall. Maybe a couple bumps in the road to start the season, but I think overall they'll be a pretty solid defense. But with that being said, that's kind of a quick little recap on all these teams, kind of the players there, who I kind of think is going to be the quarterback one, the running back one, kind of the primary wide receivers for these teams. Just kind of talking through it. Obviously, if you want the more in-depth notes on the spreadsheet, I have kind of what these guys did in their most recent season, whether it was in the XFL, the USFL, and then kind of some background on some of the guys that didn't play in either league last season. So if you're interested in this sheet whatsoever, I'll leave it as a link down in the comments below, just kind of as a free sheet. And then moving forward, if we have UFL DFS, I'll be doing my UFL sheets once again. So it's going to be talking about their salary, where I would play them, whether it's cash, GPP, or, kind of a dart throw. I'm going to be talking about anything else that is notable there as well. But with that being said, that's pretty much what I do have planned for this video. Hopefully it's something that was informative. Hopefully it was something that you guys enjoyed. And then with that being said, if you are brand new to my channel, checking out for the very first time, or have yet to subscribe, please consider doing so. Definitely would appreciate it. Helps to build the community that we're trying to build here at Coach Craig Sports, which is one that's truly for you, the viewers. Typically, I do a lot of DFS content, so if you're into NBA DFS, if you're into MLB DFS, and then obviously if you're watching this video, if we get UFL DFS, I assume that you're into that as well. So definitely be sure to check out all those videos. And then last but not least, if you're interested in sports betting, if you're interested in prop betting whatsoever, be sure to check out the links and promo codes down in the description below for BetUS, Prize Picks, and Parlay Play. If you are a brand new user on any of those three sites, when you sign up, you make your initial deposit, you will get a first match deposit bonus. For Prize Picks and Parlay Play, it's a 100% match up to $100. And then for BetUS, it's a 125% match on your initial deposit up to $2,500. So some pretty great opportunities to be had out there. If you have any other additional questions related to that whatsoever, feel free to drop them down in the comments or reach out to me on Twitter at Coach Craig Sport, and be more than happy to help you with that journey as well. But with that being said, that's all that I truly have for today's video. Hopefully you guys all found this video pretty informative. If there's anything else you'd like to see in UFL videos, whether it's UFL or UFL DFS this season, be sure to let me know down below. Let me know which team you're in for. Let me know which players you're excited for this season overall. But with that being said, I hope that each and every one of you have a great rest of your day and enjoy this UFL season overall.